Welcome to Across the Gulf Coast, highlighting organizations, events, and people from around our local community.
Hello, I'm Cam Johnson, Public Affairs Manager for Cox Communications, and I'd like to welcome you to this special episode of Across the Gulf Coast. It is that time of year here on the Gulf Coast. It's hurricane season, and it's time for us to start preparing and start planning and getting your family ready and your business ready. And we're going to talk about all the different ways that you can do that during this episode. First, we're joined by John Dosh. He's with Escambia County Emergency Management. He's going to give us all the tips and everything to get you ready for the hurricane season. John, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on the show. Welcome to the Emergency Operations Center.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's a cool little facility, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes if you don't mind. But hopefully this is the only time we have to talk to you all year and everything goes smoothly. But tell us a little bit to start off about the hurricane season, kind of when it runs, maybe peak seasons, and what they're forecasting for this year.
You know, basically it starts June 1st and runs through November 30th. The peak of the season for our part of the world is mid-September. September 12th is typically the date that everybody focuses on as far as the peak of activity. Certainly can occur any time in between June and the end of November. So we encourage everybody to be ready just in case something like that does occur. Presently right now the Storm Prediction Center and the National Hurricane Center is forecasting about 9 to 15 storms. And some of those 4 to 8 of them are going to be hurricanes, and 2 to 4 will be major hurricanes. So I anticipate at this point that we'll probably see a shift in that forecasting as we go into the season.
Sure.
Whether it goes up or down, that's the big question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of scientists looking at El Nino versus La Nina and where we're at, whether we're neutral. A lot of that will affect those numbers as well. So it'd be interesting to see where we go through the season.
It's always interesting to see what the forecast is and what the weather models show. But as you mentioned before we started rolling, all it takes is one.
That's correct. It's the one that hits you.
It's the one that hits you that matters, absolutely. So preparing for that one, what are some of the top things families need to do to prepare for a storm? How should they get ready? Really not just for a hurricane, but any kind of disaster that might strike the area. What should they do?
Certainly disaster planning, and the best thing to do is get a plan. Lay out on paper how you're going to do things, who's going to do what, where you're going to go if you're going to leave, how you're going to get there, and what time will that take. Answering all the what-if questions as you go through this. And like you said, it's not just hurricanes, it's all hazards. But specifically for hurricanes, because we're going into the season, it's good to have that plan in place. And along with that plan, you need to put together a disaster supply kit to give you the things you may need during or after a storm.
Let's talk about that supply kit. What are some items that I should have in there? What are the kind of the necessary things that people need to make sure they have?
One of the important things that people tend to forget, we focus on water, which is very important. We want to make sure we got enough water, a gallon per person per day. We want to make sure that we've got non-potable potable water and non-perishable foods to be able to provide us with nourishment after a storm, because typically the infrastructure's been impacted where we may not have electricity to cook our meals like we're normally used to. So we need to make sure that we've got things to be able to prepare without electricity. Kind of like you're camping.
Like you're camping. And to cut in real quick there, and we'll talk about the kit a little bit more, but I think people lose that a lot. When the storm moves through, they expect help right away. But how long should somebody expect to be camping, to be self-sufficient until that help does arrive?
We typically use the first 72s on you, meaning 72 hours at a minimum. And a lot of people go out there and they plan for just 3 days, and that's borderline. I would say at a minimum 3 days. I would say be prepared for at least a week. Typically we can have supplies back in, infrastructure open, roads open, to where we can get those supplies back in our community within 7 days. But if you could plan for a week, that'd probably be the best.
So when you're planning the food and the water that you mentioned, a gallon per person per day, at least 3 days, but maybe up to a week.
Right. So and just simple math. If you've got 3 people in your family, you need a gallon per person per day for a week. 7 times 3. Yeah. That's what you need. You're going to need those many gallons of water to be able to support your family. Now that's for consumption. That's not for washing or anything else. Yeah. It's strictly for consumption, because we need to make sure everybody stays hydrated.
Okay. So food and water. What are some other things that we should have in the kit?
One of the things a lot of people overlook is identities.
Yeah.
Personal information. You certainly want to make sure that you've got birth certificates or copies thereof. I would encourage people to keep the originals in either a safety deposit box or someone that's very secure, but get copies of those, put them in your disaster kit. Copies of insurance paperwork, copies of immunization for your family, things like that. Those important documents that can prove who you are and what you own and what you're insured for that you're going to need after a storm should you have an impact.
How about medications, baby needs, just anything,
Absolutely.
Clothing?
Yeah, you want to make sure that you're taking care of the entire family.
Yeah.
That includes pets,
Yeah.
Some of our fur babies, as we call them. We certainly need to keep them in the mix as well when we're doing our plans. But yes, all the babies, baby foods, make sure you got the wipes and the diapers and all that stuff to support the needs for that part of your family for at least 7 days, minimum 3 days, but 7 days.
Sure. So if I'm staying here, obviously need the kit so I can have those things. What if I'm leaving, if I'm evacuating the area? Still take those things with me, or
Absolutely.
And how do you guys? Let's talk about evacuation. How do you guys notify people when to evacuate? When is that decision made, and how does that process start?
Okay, what we do is we are in very close communications with the National Weather Service in Mobile, as well as the National Hurricane Center down in Miami. Anytime we have a storm that enters the Gulf of Mexico, we're constantly communicating with them, trying to get the latest and greatest forecast tracks as far as the intensity and where they think it's going to go. If it looks like we're going to receive an impact, we're going to start pre-planning what we think the impact is going to be, and based upon that impact, we can determine how many people we need to move. And we move people based upon storm surge.
Okay. So not wind, but storm surge.
Not wind, but storm surge.
Okay.
And we know how many people live in a storm surge zone. The state of Florida did an evacuation study and has done storm surge studies to where we have it all mapped out. And you can go to our website, type in your address, and it'll actually tell you what evacuation zone you live in, and actually show you how the storm surge would impact your property as well as your neighborhood. So we want to educate people to make sure they understand what their risks are and where they live. And once we determine that a certain area is going to be impacted, we'll issue an evacuation order for that area far enough in advance to move those people. We have evacuation zones that can range anywhere from 12 hours to up to 32 hours, depending on the size of the storm and how many people we're moving.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people see the evacuation orders coming, they start asking why so soon. But I think, showing my age a little bit, people think back to Opal. If you were here for Opal and woke up the morning of and everybody decided to leave. So once you get that information, what are some of the evacuation routes out of Escambia County? Do you recommend north, south, east, west? Depends on I guess you can't go south, but north, east, west.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend going south.
Maybe not south, but
it's going to be a personal choice, and it's going to be based upon what storm we're dealing with.
Right.
How the storm's approaching. Is it approaching from the southwest, the southeast, due south? There's a lot of variables there, and that's a personal decision that the individual's going to have to make. We're using all of our major arteries for evacuation. Highway 29, I-10, and 95, 97, just all those major arteries that we have that can allow people to get out of harm's way. Now, there's an option too. You don't have to leave the community.
Yeah.
We actually encourage people to evacuate tens of miles, not hundreds. Go inland, get out of the evacuation zone, have a friend or family member here in town, stay with them.
Yeah.
If they live in a home that you're comfortable with or a building that you're comfortable with, consider going with them. I mean, we feel more comfortable when we stay together. But bring all your stuff. Bring your disaster kit with you and everything else to support your family.
Sure.
Because they'll need to support theirs as well. So you can combine and kind of work together as a team.
If you don't have the ability to get out of the county, and you don't have a family member or friend that you can stay with, the county does have shelters open. When should I plan on going to a shelter, and where are the shelters? Not necessarily each name, but where are the shelters located? At schools, high schools?
Well, we have some community centers. The day center is one of them. We have schools throughout the county. We try to keep them geographically close to certain points of the community, so they don't have to travel real far. For those people that have issues with transportation, the ECAT bus service, when we go under a state of emergency, they focus strictly on evacuations. They actually suspend their normal routes and do nothing but moving people from the hazard areas to the shelters. And then, of course, they'll return them after the storm. So there's a lot of coordination and working with our partner organizations during a storm or before a storm to get people to be out of harm's way.
So if I am out of harm's way, the storm moves through, how long should I wait before I plan on coming back to my home?
A lot of it has to do with the accessibility. Initially, as soon as the winds die down below tropical storm force, we try to get folks out for search and rescue. We try to get the debris removed from the roads so transportation can occur. we want to make sure that it's safe for you to get back home. So if you can give us 12 to 24 hours before you return, that's probably a good idea. That allows us to get the roads cleared up, make sure everything, any bridges that you may have to go over, they all have to be inspected.
Yeah.
Make sure that they weren't damaged to where they're unsafe. So there's a lot of things that have to occur in a 24-hour period. If they can give us that time, that's best.
And the same goes, I guess, for people who stayed home. And a lot of times you don't have power,
Right.
so you get in the car and to drive around, look at damage, and enjoy what little bit of air conditioner you might have.
Right.
But y'all, to your point, you guys are out on the road, so you ask them to stay home for a little while.
Right. If they don't absolutely have to, if it's not a life-threatening ordeal where they need to get out and move around, we encourage them to stay home. There's going to be all kinds of debris, down power lines, utility disruptions all over the place, and the hazards are extremely high
Yeah.
at that point. And we encourage people just to stay off the roads, to allow the emergency workers and the utility workers to get out there and get that cleaned out of the way so you can move around more freely.
And then cleaning up the process, for the people at home, while they're going through the yard, you might find some hazards, as you mentioned. What are some safety tips that you can give to people at home as they're evaluating their property damage, cleaning up their property, and things of that nature?
Well, certainly one of the things that we see after a storm, we see a lot of people doing a lot of very strenuous activities after a storm that maybe their health isn't where it should be to where they can do those types of activities. If you don't normally do those types of things where you're outside, you got to realize we're dealing with summertime heat, we're dealing with high humidity, we're dealing with no power, so that means no air conditioning, and there's a lot of stress on the human body during those periods of time, not only physical stress but emotional stress. And we need to make sure everybody's taking care of themselves, they're hydrating. If you're not used to using a chainsaw, maybe it's a good idea to holler at a friend or a neighbor that is using a chainsaw, because those are little buzz saws, and we have a lot of injuries and that occur as a result of not being familiar with that. And after a storm, people tend to do things they don't normally do. So we just encourage people to basically stay within their expertise if they can. If they don't know what they're doing with things, to call somebody and see if they can get some help with it.
And especially if they see a line that's down.
Absolutely. Electricity, if you see a line down, assume all power lines on the ground are energized and extremely dangerous.
And speaking of power lines and everything else, I know we hear a lot after a storm moves through about generator safety. Can you give us a few tips about how people should be safe when using their generators at home?
Absolutely. There's a couple things that you need to understand. When you're using portable generators, it's not a good idea to plug the generator into your house. Okay, what happens is that creates a situation called backfeeding. And backfeeding actually allows that electricity to not only go through your house, but go back out on the power lines into the system. And unfortunately, the poor power line guy that's up there trying to get your power back on, he's done everything he needs to do to secure power from that perspective. He doesn't know that you're backfeeding power up. And we've had powermen here locally that actually have been killed as a result of that. So it's a very, very dangerous practice to do. Plug the portable generator in directly into the appliance that you're using. So if you're using a refrigerator, unplug it from the wall, use an extension cord and plug it directly into the generator itself. Unless you have like a whole house generator.
Sure.
Then of course that's pre-wired, been inspected and all that. Another consideration that needs to be taken is these are internal combustion engines that produce carbon monoxide, and we need to be very careful of that. That's a poison, odorless, colorless gas. There's a lot of fatalities that occurred across the country as a result of people not understanding. They need to have those things out and away from the house to where they can appropriately dissipate that carbon monoxide and not get in your home.
JD, we got about 3 minutes or so left, but tell me a little bit about this room that we're in. We're here at the EOC for Escambia County Emergency Operations Center. Tell us a little bit about what goes on here as a storm is approaching and or any kind of disaster that takes place. I know you guys have been activated for a whole lot more than just a storm over the last several years. So tell me a little bit about this building and this facility.
Well, the building was built in 2004. It was we moved in about a month after Hurricane Ivan, actually. And the facility is designed, it's a communication coordination point for all activities in the county when you're dealing with any type of disaster response. We have better than 90 different agencies, governmental, not-for-profit, volunteer organizations that come in here and support the response and recovery to whatever we're dealing with. This is, disasters are a community-wide impact. It requires a community-wide response.
Right.
And you can't do that without coordination, and that's what this room does. We work with all our partners. whether they be governmental or nonprofit, for-profit, or volunteer organizations, to help get our community back on its feet. And that's what this room's for. It's for coordinating all those activities. Make sure we're all working from the same, singing from the same sheet of music, and being as efficient as we can.
And it's really impressive to watch when it is activated and how everybody does work together, all the information flowing out of here. The media has a room here set up off to the side of the EOC where they can be given the information and that needs to be dispersed out to the public. So it really is a great facility that you have out here. So anything we didn't ask you, any other safety tips or planning tips or anything that we didn't cover that you think is important to mention?
You know, like I said, I just want to reiterate that people, it's the individual responsibility to be prepared, and we want to encourage that. Certainly, we've got all kinds of information that can help them develop their disaster plan and basically go over what our hazards are in our part of the world. And developing that plan is key, and getting that disaster kit ready to go and involving the entire family. I think that in itself is one of the key components, and making sure that everybody's ready to go.
And one thing real quick, I just remember this from experience, I would say, if you're planning on getting your property ready, do it now. If you're going to cut down the tree, if you're going to trim your leaves, or even cut the grass or rake the yard, when you put it on the side of the road pre-storm, it clogs up drains, becomes flying projectiles and things of that nature. So if you're going to do it now.
Right. So that's a preseason activity.
That's a preseason activity, absolutely. Right. John, thank you so much for coming on the show this year. Like I said, hopefully this is it, and the only time we have to talk to you until next year. But good luck with this year, I guess.
Thank you. You too.
Absolutely. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to be joined by somebody to tell you how to prepare your business in case of a storm.